For most individuals, working and saving money to become work optional or retire is an important factor or goal that they have. One of the ways to make sure that your savings can last you and you can become work optional or retire is a retirement plan, a retirement projection. Here are three things you want to look at in that retirement plan to make sure that that retirement plan success rate is actually going to be successful. Number one, you want to make sure that you're living long enough in that projection. If you're projecting to live to 80 or 85 and you live to 90 or 95, there may be a potential issue. Number two, you want to make sure that the expenses are correct and not being underestimated and properly being inflated over time. Eventually, inflation is going to make those expenses eat away at your principal. And number three, you want to make sure that you are projecting a realistic return. An 8, 9, 10% return is most likely not realistic. You're not going to be that aggressive. And if you are that aggressive, we may not get that type of return in the market. So I'm going to show you how you look at the plan, make sure that those numbers are correct, and that the success that you're seeing is actually a success to have the retirement you want to have. So let's take an example of how overestimating your returns or underestimating your expenses or not projecting the plan to live long enough can potentially impact your plan. Let's look at this plan here for John and Jane Smith. John is 70 years old and Jane is 66, and they're going into retirement. They have a little over $1 million saved and they have about a 60-40 portfolio. In their retirement, they are going to get income of Social Security. John gets about $48,000 and Jane gets about $30,000. From their expense standpoint, they need roughly about $100,000 a year. They live in New Jersey. And so roughly they're taking about $20,000 to $30,000 off the portfolio. From a back of the envelope situation, this plan looks to be pretty successful. Let's break it down and look into it a little bit more. As we talked about, John is 70 and Jane is 66. If they get around $80,000 a year from Social Security and they need $100,000 to live off of, their probability of success is 99%. Now, in this scenario, they're living to 85 years old. And the probability says that somewhere between 1.7 and almost $5 million is what they're going to be left with at 85 years old when Jane passes away. And so if I look at the scenario, I feel pretty confident, feel like I have a great time to enjoy my life and there's no real worries to worry about. However, let's stress this a little bit more. Let's assume that instead of passing away at 85, they pass away at 100 years old. And so our success rate goes down to about 97%. But the upside goes from almost 5 million to close to 9.4 million. Downside drops a little bit and our median goes up a little bit. So that's basically telling us that if they live to 100 and need $100,000 a year, they're in a good spot. They're really not taking much out of principal, and essentially the portfolio continues to grow and the expenses they have are not eating away at principal. So they're in a phenomenal spot from that standpoint if they live longer than expected. But let's say that they live longer and their growth rate actually goes down a little bit. So instead of getting close to 8%, they get more around 5%. So our probability goes to 100% here if everything gets an average of 5%. But you see the outcomes are a lot less, right? We dropped from 9 million, almost 9.5 million down to 1.4 million, and our bottom was 1.7 down to about, or 1.6 down to about 1.3. So still a successful plan, still feeling pretty good about that, but your probability of success and the amount that you're going to have, essentially, if we have a underperforming market, you're going to see less of a portfolio growth and essentially kind of a net neutral standpoint, but still leaving some assets to beneficiaries if you want to. And let's look at the last standpoint. Let's look if we actually underestimated our expenses. So instead of needing $100,000, let's say we need 115, and then when John passes away, we drop a little bit and it goes to 110, right? Now all of a sudden, this plan changes drastically. So if we're off by about $15,000 a year, which is only a little over $1,000 extra a month, that plan goes from a positive 97 to 100% success rate to a 72% success rate. Again, still a good number, but now we're looking at if we have bad markets or a bad sequence of returns, you potentially running out of money at 100 years old. And the median is about $90,000. So this plan really does start to get stressed significantly. And so this is why we look at things and say, okay, well, the plans are great, but if we want to have a successful plan, we want to make sure that we stress this as much as possible and look at the worst case scenario. And if we're still looking fairly successful in the worst case scenario, then we feel comfortable working with individuals and saying you are on track for the retirement you want to live. Look, getting a retirement plan and a projection is super important to make sure that you can enjoy the work optional retirement life that you want to have. However, you have to be aware that you're looking at the correct numbers and you're not over projecting or underestimating to make the plan look better than it actually is. Again, make sure that the plan runs to 100 years old. Make sure that you're getting a realistic return and make sure your expenses and inflation to those expenses is correct. If you need help looking at your plan or want to rerun it to make sure that your retirement is going to be successful, reach out. I'm here to help.